In the 1870s, among the Winta Ute, dogs were part of daily life and the economy. They served in light transport with travois, supported hunts, guarded camps, and marked rites. Even after the adoption of the horse and the pressure of the reservations, they retained practical and symbolic value, mediating family ties and the circulation of goods. Sitting Bull, Hunkpapa Lakota chief, led the resistance to U.S. expansion in the Great Plains. He forged alliances and, in 1876, his leadership sustained the victory at Little Bighorn. He went into exile in Canada, later surrendered in 1881, performed in Buffalo Bill's show, and died while being arrested at Standing Rock during the Ghost Dance. In 1873, near Old Fort Defiance in what was then New Mexico, Timothy H. O'Sullivan recorded a moment in Navajo routine. People gathered around a loom, a sign of textile production. Next to it, weapons and hunting gear. Further ahead, corn cobs in the sun, indicating agricultural practices and storage during a period of reorganization on the reservations. A photo taken in 1948 shows the final gathering of survivors of the Battle of Little Bighorn, fought in 1876. Gathered on the battlefield, Lakota and Cheyenne elders and 7th Cavalry veterans recalled the clash and honored the dead. The meeting marked the end of a cycle of direct testimonies about the Plains Wars. If you love the Wild West and enjoy vintage pinup portraits, I've left a bonus for you in the pinned comment. A pack with 50 vintage cowgirl posters, available for a limited time. In the 1880s, he served as a scout for the U.S. Cavalry and became known as Apache Kid. Among his people, he was Haskaibenaintail, brave and tall, who will have a mysterious end. After being arrested, he escaped during the transfer to the territorial prison in Yuma, Arizona in 1889, and since then his whereabouts have remained unknown. In 1903, Edward S. Curtis recorded among the Apaches a scene of daily life. A woman collecting water in a woven basket, waterproofed with pine resin. Apache basket makers produced these containers for transport and domestic use. It was their responsibility to ensure the supply that sustained the camp. The practice was common in the Southwest regions. In 1885, Sitting Bull, Hunkpapa Lakota chief, lived under surveillance after surrendering in 1881 and leaving captivity in 1883. Residing in Standing Rock, he was granted permission to join Buffalo Bill's show for a few months. He used part of the payment for his community and remained a symbol of resistance to treaties and colonial expansion. Eagle Hunter. The scene shows a Hidatsa man holding a captured eagle, standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking a wide valley. Edward S. Curtis's framing combines subsistence right and landscape, recording indigenous practices and their relationship with the land. That is why his images still challenge viewers today. In Strength and Visions, Edward S. Curtis recorded a crow, Apsaroki man during the Sundance. Slightly bent, he has leather thongs crossing his chest, attached to a pole fixed with stones. The piercing rite, central to collective renewal, lasted at least 4 days. The participant was only released after achieving a vision. 7 leaders of the Crow Nation pose in front of a building in Montana, 1887. The record is set in the context of negotiations with federal authorities, when chiefs visited administrative centers to address reservation boundaries, provisions, and government mediation. The scene illustrates Native political visibility in the late 19th century. In 1900, George Bird Grinnell invited Edward S. Curtis to document the Blackfoot. On that year's expedition, which produced the image of 3 Confederation chiefs, Curtis defined his themes and method. 6 years later, this experience led J.P. Morgan to fund the multi-volume ethnographic and photographic work titled The North American Indian. Recorded by James Dempsey Hutton during William F. Reynolds's expedition to Yellowstone in 1859. This image of the Arapaho, with Warshanan on the right, is part of the first photographic set of the group. Circulating in albums and reports, It helped establish in the late 19th and early 20th centuries the practice of portraying frontier indigenous peoples. In 1912, near Winslow, Arizona, a Navajo mother poses with her children and a dog. The scene records clothing and utensils of pastoral daily life, with the desert in the background and the expanding railroad. The portrait captures family, seasonal mobility, and adjustments to the pressures of the period. It indicates sheep herding and changes in federal policies. I'll leave a secret bonus in the pinned comment for those who love the Old West. Don't miss it. It's for a limited time. Uriwichi, a Shoshone known as Jack Tendoy, was part of the Lemhi and Fort Hall Agency delegation that signed the Treaty of May 14, 1880. Photographed by Charles M. Bell in Washington, he symbolizes the federal policy that ultimately concentrated Shoshone, Bannock, and Lemhi at Fort Hall, Idaho. I'll leave a secret bonus in the pinned comment for those who love the Old West. Don't miss it. It's for a limited time. The Arikara Nightmen were part of a medicine ceremony offered to ask for rain and sustenance. The practice was banned by the U.S. government since 1885. In 1908, photographer Edward S. Curtis staged a reenactment of the ritual, allowing it to be recorded despite the ban and revealing tensions between repression and cultural preservation. Studio portrait of Jimmy Sequent, a member of the Northern Shoshone, taken in Pocatello, Idaho in 1897. The image, made in a posed environment with controlled lighting, records his native identity during a period of political transformations in the American West. Siksika man recorded at Fort Belknap, Montana in 1917, at the time carrying a ceremonial pipe used in meetings and pacts. The image belongs to the context of assimilation policies and ethnographic mapping of the Northern Plains. The Siksika presence indicates networks of movement and alliances of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Bannock Braves. After serving as field secretary to the governor in the Bannock War, 1878, Major Lee Morehouse took over in 1889 as agent of the Umatilla Reservation, Oregon. Between 1888 and 1916, he produced more than 9,000 photographs of life in Umatilla County and the Columbia Basin, recording from left to right, Jim Mukai and Ponga. Edward S. Curtis's record of Cheyenne dancers at the Sundance in 1900 Montana. The annual rite, a core of spiritual renewal and social cohesion, persisted despite federal repressive measures. Ceremonial attire and the central tree indicate the setup of the camp. Lone Sitting Bull Dakota Man, a figure from the 1880s, lived through the transition into reservations under federal pressure. With the decline of the buffalo and forced relocations, he dealt with assimilation policies, military surveillance, and mediation with agents. His path records daily resistance in maintaining rituals, language, and kinship. Brave Buffalo, mentioned in 19th century Plains accounts, appears as a leader and counselor of his community. In contact with settlers, he mediated conflicts and protected rights. His trajectory shows tensions between European expansion, fragile treaties, and indigenous resistance. The lack of dates reveals a figure preserved through oral memory and traveler's notes. Hand-colored photograph of Chief Bone Necklace of the Oglala Lakota Nation, circa 1899. The studio portrait follows the late 19th century practice of applying pigments over black and white prints to highlight clothing, ornaments, and status. It records leadership during the reservation period and assimilation policies. Portrait of Old Crow and Pretty Medicine Pipe, leaders of the Apsaluk Crow people. The image, taken in 1873, shows ceremonial clothing and adornments at a time of intense contact with federal agents and explorers in the Northern Plains. The portrait serves as a visual source on identities and alliances of the period. Gall Fitzy, Hunkpapa Lakota leader born in 1840 in the Moreau Valley, acted as a strategist in the Plains Wars. An ally of Sitting Bull, he reacted to the death of relatives in the initial attack and led decisive strikes at Little Bighorn, 1876. He surrendered in 1881, lived on reservations, and advocated for political adaptation. He died in 1894. In 1908, during the Montana winter, two Apsaluk on horseback wait in front of a tipi surrounded by a snowy pine forest, in the traditional territory of the Crow Nation. The scene records mobility and shelter, with horses as the axis of movement and hunting. The camp highlights seasonal adaptation and cultural continuity in harsh conditions. Portrait of Mr. Wildgun and his family, members of the Blackfeet Nation, taken in the early 20th century in Montana, likely on the Blackfeet Reservation. The scene records a transition. Clothing combines traditional elements and trade items, amid disputes over land and assimilation policies. Photograph by N.A. Forsyth. Chief Kalkalshuatash, portrayed in 1868, was part of the Nez Perce delegation from the Pacific Northwest in Washington, D.C. He wears ceremonial clothing, holding a feather fan and pipe. They sought to reinstate clauses lost in the 1863 treaty. Despite hearings with federal authorities, funds intended for the tribe continued to be diverted by government agents. In 1914, two Navajo men mount their horses at the base of Shiprock, Tsebitai, in northwestern New Mexico, in the Four Corners region. The record shows mobility and pastoral work, when Dine families moved between pastures and villages, under increasing federal administration and boarding schools, with links to local markets. The name Chief Little Wolf is associated with Bozeman, Montana, around 1874. At that time, the Northern Cheyennes moved between camps under pressure from miners and troops. Army records mention contacts, negotiations, and relocations to reservation areas, as well as constant surveillance. Comanche Camp of Horseback. Tarakoip, known in English as Horseback, was chief of the Noconi Band. Afflicted by lung bleeding, he remained in his camp, where William S. Soule photographed him in 1873 at the Wichita Agency near Fort Sill in Indian Territory. Sick, he came to advocate for peace and surrender to reservation life. Studio portrait of an unidentified Ute man, taken in Denver, Colorado, around 1861. The image, produced in a controlled environment, records the clothing and bearing of the subject and bears witness to the Ute presence in the region at the beginning of territorial expansion and the work of commercial photographers in the West. At Camp Verde, Arizona Territory, around 1877, merchant William S. Head posed with his dog, Boss, alongside a 28-year-old Apache known to soldiers as Mickey Free. The scene, captured in a photograph, suggests practical ties between local trade, military presence, and indigenous scouts on the frontier of the period. Among the Pawnee, Crooked Hand, despite his paralyzed hand, stood out in war campaigns and was cited by anthropologist George Bird Grinnell as the greatest warrior of the tribe. His son, Dog Chief, served as an indigenous scout for the U.S. Army in the 1870s. The photograph of Crooked Hand dates to about 1870, 3 years before his death. Little Soldier, leader of a northwestern Shoshone band in the Utah Territory in 1869, acted amid the railroad expansion and the effects of the Bear River Massacre, 1863. He led seasonal migrations, mediated conflicts with settlers and the Army, seeking to preserve hunting and fishing routes in the face of settlement pressure. In 1886, after the surrender, Geronimo and his group were gathered at Fort Bowie in southeastern Arizona, near present-day Wilcox. Under Army escort, they marched to Bowie Station. There, as prisoners of war, they were recorded and searched, and by federal order boarded trains bound for Florida and exile. Among the Dakota, domestic tanning followed known steps. With a paste made from brains and fats, the craftswoman spread and rubbed buffalo hide, breaking fibers and retaining lubrication. Then she stretched, dried, and scraped it, obtaining a malleable material suitable for making tunics, parfleches, moccasins, and other everyday items. Studio portrait of 4 Apache Scouts, 1888. Recruited by the U.S. Army since 1871, they served as guides and trackers in the final campaigns of the Southwest. They pose in uniform, with rifles and bandanas, indicating military integration and identity. The image records the post-Geronimo period and the native role in active border surveillance. In 1886, at the conclusion of the Apache Wars, Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood, with only 2 scouts, entered a camp in the Sierra Madre, south of the Mexican border. There he conducted direct negotiations with Geronimo and secured his surrender, committing him to present himself to General Nelson A. Miles for transfer into custody. Courtship with flute among the Yuma. Youth sought partners by playing melodies, a practice that marked the passage into adulthood and dialogue between families. The scene was recorded by Isaiah West Tabor, a Yuma musician from Arizona, posed in a studio in San Francisco around 1885, reflecting indigenous mobility and photographic networks of the period. Alone with the past. In 1913, 2 Dean Navajo observed from the bottom of Canyon de Chelly, Arizona, the Casablanca ruins, an ancient ancestral Pueblo settlement built in sandstone niches and occupied between the 11th and 14th centuries. The scene records indigenous continuity in the face of pre-contact remains. Today, a protected area as a national monument. In 1875, after tensions over food and the authoritarianism of agents, Navajo groups surrounded the agency at Fort Defiance. Organized by local leaders, they occupied warehouses and offices, interrupted the superintendent's orders, and demanded administrative changes. The action, carried out without gunfire, marked a turning point in the daily control of the post. Geronimo Goyakla, born in 1829 among the Badonkohe Apaches, became a war leader after Mexican attacks that killed his family. He led long escapes and ambushes against Mexico and the U.S. until surrendering in 1886. Kept as a prisoner of war, he lived at Fort Sill, took part in fairs, and died in 1909. He became a symbol of resistance. Thatlo Harjo, born in 1791, joined the Seminole forces and fought in both Seminole Wars. In 1842, he was removed to Indian Territory. During the Civil War in 1861, he enlisted in the 1st Regiment. After the conflict, he settled in the area that would become Seminole County, Oklahoma, with other Seminoles. He died in 1904 at the age of 113. Known as Apache Kid, Haske Bay Nayantale first served as an indigenous scout for the U.S. Army. After internal conflicts and clashes between Apaches and settlers, trial and escape, he began living outside the law. In the 1880s and 1890s, he became the most hunted fugitive in the Arizona Territory, a symbol of the tensions of the post-Apache War era. The Tamed Tiger. Geronimo, the Apache leader whom General Nelson A. Miles nicknamed Human Tiger, appears in this photograph in a controlled pose, a sign of captivity and U.S. federal surveillance. A similar image with him in a painted hat opened his autobiography, published in 1906, used to shape his public memory after surrender. In 1874, a group of Southern Paiutes agreed to pose for a photograph. The session, typical of the period, took place in a setting prepared by the photographer, possibly linked to a trading post in the region. The portrait served purposes of record and study, fixing faces, everyday clothing, and native presence under the pressure of colonial expansion. Carte de visite portrait, taken in 1884 at the San Carlos Reservation, in what was then the Arizona Territory, shows Geronimo Chiricahua Apache leader, under federal surveillance during the confinement imposed by the U.S. Army. It is the earliest known photographic record of the chief, prior to the campaigns of 1885-1886, in the popular commercial format. Interior of Mrs. American Horse's house. Oglala Lakota women and children gather in the domestic space in 1891, recorded by John C. H. Grabel. The resident was the wife of Oglala Chief American Horse, a prominent figure in the Great Sioux War of 1876-1877. The scene likely took place at Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, United States. Uinta Paiute hunter, standing in the arid plateau landscape of southwestern Utah, aims a rifle around 1873. The scene marks transition. Trade weapons, subsistence hunting, settler pressure, and federal policies that limited mobility and territories. Clothing and gear suggest seasonal movement between valleys and rivers. Looking Glass, also called Alalimia Takanin, served as a war chief of the Nez Perce in 1877. After the federal removal order, he coordinated marches and battles, defended the route toward Canada and contact with the Crow. He led the retreat after Clearwater and Big Hole while Joseph negotiated. Together they kept the group cohesive until Bear Paw. In northeastern Arizona, a Hopi woman knelt combing and shaping the hair of a young girl. The strands were rolled into side spirals called squash blossom. The arrangement indicated that the girl had completed puberty rites and was ready to marry. A daily practice among the Hopi, it also served as a public sign of family status. In 1906, the Salish leader known as Chief Eagle, Atoam Elam Wot Skill Me, was portrayed on the Flathead Reservation, Montana. The image, made under federal assimilation and land management policies, records clothing and insignia of authority, and helps to understand Salish hierarchies and identities at the beginning of the 20th century, amid tribal disputes. Custer and Bloody Knife kneeling on the left. Portrait taken around 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer poses next to Bloody Knife, an Arikara scout who served as guide and interpreter in the campaigns against the Plains Nations, months before the Battle of Little Bighorn, in the Montana Territory, under the command of the 7th Cavalry. Hunting Horse, Kiowa leader, appears with his daughters in a 1908 photograph taken by J.V. Dedrick in Tologa, Oklahoma. The image documents the Kiowa family in a phase of transition to the reservation system and new federal policies. He served as a scout for General George Custer. He lived 107 years and died in 1953, the year this magazine was founded. Portrait of Red Hawk, Oglala Lakota warrior, taken by Edward S. Curtis in the Badlands, South Dakota, around 1905. The image records a leader in the post-Plains Wars transition, when Lakota communities lived under the reservation system and sought to preserve language, rights, and tribal authority in the face of federal assimilation policy. Around 1888, Mickey Free, a mixed-heritage Apache scout raised among the Chiricahua, appears alongside his wives Ethle and Ochahe. The scene documents domestic life and the alliances of scouts in the service of the U.S. Army in the Southwest, in the Arizona Territory after the Apache Wars and Geronimo's surrender, acting as mediators. Thanks to public notoriety, Geronimo, Chiricahua Apache leader, obtained a place of prominence in the procession of indigenous chiefs who took part in Theodore Roosevelt's presidential inauguration. On March 4, 1905, in Washington, D.C., the leaders passed in review before the new president, and Geronimo's name drew special attention in the formation. Chief Joseph, leader of the Nez Perce of the Wallowa Valley, Oregon, stood out in the War of 1877 by leading his group in the retreat toward Canada, trying to avoid forced removal by the U.S. Army. After surrendering in Montana, he became a native spokesperson and traveled to Washington, advocating for a return to the ancestral Northwest. In 1906, the Salish leader known as Chief Eagle, Atoam Elam Wot Skill Me, was photographed at the Flathead Reservation in Montana. He served as a community reference during the transition imposed by federal policies, mediating relations with government agents and preserving rights, language, and kinship networks, as well as changes in hunting and horse breeding. Wheeler's Survey of the Apaches. Photographer Timothy H. O'Sullivan took part between 1871 and 1874 in Lieutenant George M. Wheeler's expedition in the Southwest, west of the 100th meridian. Overturned boats caused the loss of most of the 300 negatives sent east. What remained was the image Apache Indians, as they appear ready for war. Portrait of Eastern Shoshone leader Washakie, taken by William Henry Jackson around 1870 in Wyoming. Made during Western survey expeditions linked to geology and the railroad, the record presents the chief in representative attire and is part of the visual corpus that documented Native negotiations and displacements in the period. Record from 1900 depicts Navajo Yebichai dancers in the Nightway ceremony, a ritual of healing and restoration of order. With masks representing the holy beings, they advance in a row, marking steps with rattles and alternating chants. The rite, lasting 9 nights, includes sand paintings, is performed in winter, and is guided by the ceremonial singer. John Grass, also called Charging Bear, was a Hunkpapa Lakota leader of the Standing Rock Reservation. After the Sioux Wars, he stood out as a mediator with U.S. authorities, took part in delegations to Washington, 1888-89, and negotiated land cessions. He advocated for schools and gradual adaptation, without abandoning tribal practices. He died in 1918. Looking Glass, Alalimia Takanin, Nez Perce war chief, stood out in the 1877 campaign. After federal pressures for removal, he defended a strategic retreat through Idaho to Montana, seeking support from the Crow. He faced Big Hole and other actions, leading the flight toward Canada, until falling at Bear Paw, when the resistance collapsed in October. Portrait of Red Hawk, Oglala Lakota warrior, taken by Edward S. Curtis around 1905 in the Badlands, South Dakota. The photograph is part of Curtis's documentation project, aimed at recording indigenous societies at the beginning of the 20th century, when the imposition of reservations and federal policies reshaped Oglala life. In 1891, photographer John C. H. Grable recorded a camp of Brule Lakota typists, set up near the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. The scene shows horses gathered at the watering point of White Clay Creek. The image is part of the visual documentation of the post-Plains War period and federal control over the reservations. Irontail, Oglala Lakota chief, became a public figure in Buffalo Bill's Wild West tours. His profile inspired, in 1913, the U.S. 5-cent nickel. Alongside Black Diamond, a famous bison from New York zoos, he symbolizes the meeting of native memory and the frontier myth in the early 20th century. Record from 1873 by Timothy H. O'Sullivan. Dine Navajo family beside a loom, near Old Fort Defiance, New Mexico. In an albumen print, the portrait documents domestic textile work after the Navajo Wars and the proximity of the federal post, highlighting economy and daily life. It indicates contact with federal agents. Mickey Free at Camp Verde. In 1860, the Apaches kidnapped Felix Ward, then a boy wearing breechcloths and moccasins. 17 years later, at the Camp Verde Reservation, Arizona, white-style clothing was beginning to spread. Ward appears there second from the right. He enlisted as an Army Scout in 1872 and later tried to track the renegade Apache Kid. Chief Red Cloud, Oglala Lakota, portrayed at 77 years old in 1898 by J.H. Bratley. A decisive political and military leader in the wars over the Black Hills region, he became a central negotiator after the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, witnessing the transition of Lakota power in the face of U.S. expansion. The portrait marks his final authority. In 1886, after surrendering to Nelson Miles in Arizona, Geronimo was taken with part of the Chiricahuas to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. There, as a prisoner of war, he underwent interrogations and exhibitions before being sent to Florida. Warriors to Fort Pickens, families to Fort Marion, marking the passage from Apache conflict to federal captivity. In Lame Deer, Montana, Julia Tuell recorded Northern Cheyenne girls in playful activity that reproduced collective practices. They cared for deerskin dolls and set up small tippies in a circle. The scene highlights the transmission of norms from the large camp, where spatial order guided kinship, tasks, and rituals in children's daily life. In 1890, in Oklahoma, Quanah Parker, son of Chief Peta Nocona, and the Anglo-American captive Cynthia Ann, consolidated himself as the last recognized Comanche chief. He led the Quahati in the final campaigns, surrendered in 1875, and negotiated life on the reservation. He became a cattle rancher, advocate of peyotism, and mediator between authorities and his people. In 1868, at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, General William T. Sherman, third from the left, meets with federal commissioners to negotiate with Lakota Sioux chiefs and leaders. The meeting was part of the talks that culminated in the Treaty of 1868, defining territorial boundaries, rites of passage, and military obligations in the Great Plains region. Among the UTEs, willow cradleboards were the standard. With the reservation period, the practice of fitting the board into deerskin bags spread, a solution that protected and facilitated transport. The 1899 photograph records Peret's baby in this arrangement, showing adaptation to the new conditions imposed in the American West. In 1886, at Fort Bowie, Nietzsche, son of Cochise and Geronimo Chiricahua leaders, negotiated surrender to the U.S. Army after years of flight. The removal was decided as prisoners of war of warriors and families. The act ended Apache resistance in the Southwest and preceded the boarding for exile in Florida, by rail and under federal custody. In 1886, at the Pueblo of Acoma, then New Mexico Territory, Governor Eusebius and Sheriff Lewis appear as civil authorities of the community. The governor presided over internal matters, rituals, and relations with federal agents. The sheriff oversaw local order and the enforcement of collective decisions, record from a phase of adaptation to U.S. laws. A photograph from 1905 records 4 Navajo horsemen in Canon del Muerto, a branch of Canyon de Chelly, Arizona. In Dine territory, the scene reveals mobility and trade networks maintained despite federal assimilation policies. The use of the horse and the route through the canyon indicate cultural continuity and control of space in the early 20th century. Photographic record of Shoshone leader Washakie, produced by William Henry Jackson around 1870 in present-day Wyoming. The image is part of Western survey campaigns, when Jackson documented native peoples and landscapes. Washakie appears in traditional attire, highlighting leadership and diplomatic role in treaties with the United States. Soldier of the 10th U.S. Cavalry Regiment poses alongside 3 Apache scouts at Fort Whipple, Arizona Territory, around 1885. The image records military cooperation in the final period of the Apache Wars, when regular units and native auxiliaries took part in patrols and capture operations.